Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Dr. Travis Brown, what is This Medical Life all about?
This is the pursuit of knowledge as we learn about diseases from the ancient times to the present day. These are the stories of medicine.
I want a goddamn statement on marijuana. I mean one on marijuana that just tears the ass out of them. By God, we're gonna hit the marijuana thing, and I want to hit it right square in the puss. I want to hit it against legalizing and all that sort of thing.
Dr. Travis Brown, what was that?
We're talking about medical cannabis and medical marijuana today. And so we are going into an area that is actually quite politically charged. And this is actually throughout the history of cannabis and marijuana, it's always been controversial. And that's the amazing thing. I thought, we've just brought in, no, it's actually it originated out of Central Asia and Western China. Now, it's even listed in the Pharmacopoeia of the Red Emperor Shen Yang in 2800 BCE. Now, the problem is, the ancient Chinese are probably the first people to farm it, but they also seem to be the first people to outlaw it. And so what happened? Well, it came in when 600 BCE, the rise of Taoism rejected intoxicants, and marijuana was seen as antisocial, as a loony drug reserved for shaman.
Gee, that sounds like the films that America made in the 1950s.
Well, and here's the balance that keeps on happening with this is, it's also listed by the ancient Romans, Greeks, Assyrians. It's in religions as well. And, Hindu, the supreme god of Shiva, his favorite food was the cannabis plant. And so the medicinal properties of cannabis was seen as you're pleasing the gods. That's why you're getting this alleviating feeling. And fever was seen as the hot breath of God, or the gods. And so those who had fever had somehow angered the gods by your behavior, something you've done. And they would have religious rites, including cannabis, that we now know most likely works on people's hypothalamic area and reduces the chances of fever. And so this is wound into other religions, Muslim societies. Early Arabic texts describe hashish as the bush of understanding, the morsel of thought. And
wow, I love that terminology, the bush of understanding.
Yeah, but Muhammad prohibited intoxicants. So now it's marijuana and intoxicants. So some people say, well, did he include marijuana in that? It's a bit controversial. If we take to, Catholicism, the late 1400s, Pope Innocent VIII saw cannabis as a mind-altering drug, and it was used by pagans. And so he thought it's used by witches and sorcerers. This was an existential threat.
Wow.
And so
no one was allowed to use it.
So he declared cannabis an unholy sacrament of the satanic masses, and then those who cultivated it were either imprisoned, exiled, or sentenced to death. And so you're seeing, throughout, human history, this weird dynamic of marijuana being used and having the effects, or cannabis having these effects, and probably the ruling establishment saying this is bad.
And the irony, of course, is the thing that we know about it is it tends to lead the users to be a bit mellow, but these reactions are anything other. They seem flamboyantly violent in some ways.
Yeah. Well, here's the interesting thing. This is when the British Empire with India. Now, marijuana was about there. Now, they considered banning it, and the local authorities wanted it banning, but the British Parliament thought, here's an opportunity. We can raise some tax revenue for this. And so they ended up going and creating the market and taxing it. It created quite a lot of money. Now, they had consistent times through the 1800s where they considered banning it, but didn't. The tax revenue won out.
Yes.
And so this is...
Sounding reminiscent about tobacco too.
Well, but it's not until sort of the mid-1800s we've got an Irish doctor, William O'Shannessy, who started advocating this actually could be a useful therapy for patients. Mind you, it even gets to this point where, Vanity Fair in the late 1800s, they said there's hashish candy, and there's, it helps with nervousness and melancholy. It's pleasurable and has, is a harmless stimulant, and it's even advertised.
Under its influence, all classes seem to gather new inspiration and energy.
So this brings us into the United States in the early 1900s. Mm-hmm. And there's the Mexican Revolution, and cannabis increases in popularity. Mm-hmm. But then between 1913 and 1932, states begin to ban it. By the time of 1930s, about 28 states have banned cannabis use. Now, in the 1930s, it's depicted as a dangerous drug used by Black Americans, Mexican immigrants, poor people, all associated with committing crimes. And so there is a movie, it's called a cult movie. It's called Reefer Madness.
Yes, I've seen it.
Have you seen it? What's it like?
It's bizarre, and it is, you can tell, it's propaganda. Goebbels would have been proud.
Well, and that was given to the audience, and it had the exaggerated effect of cannabis, and by then they implemented the marijuana tax, or not the J, the H, specifically, the Marijuana Tax Act, that it effectively outlawed cannabis. And what it did, it made it so prohibitively expensive that no one could afford it. And so that led into 1951, the Boggs Act, which had then mandatory sentencing for drug offences. And this was, ended up going into almost, 1965, 1969, when that law was challenged and repealed. But Richard Nixon came in the 1970s and labelled drugs public enemy number one. And this is where marijuana was certainly one of them. So it's, Australia was in the same boat. Early 20th century, the Commonwealth banned cannabis, and then states over the next few decades followed suit.
He must have been right, though, the 37th president, because he's such a noble and moral man. So whatever he said must have been right.
Well, here's the thing, and everyone through that, drugs was the enemy. Just say no. It was honestly a topic that they felt they could win, and they did win. And so we then historically look at that. I mean, this is where cannabis sits. It's always been this complex political, probably some medical benefits, but that's been outweighed by ruling classes, by governments saying, no, this is dangerous. And so we fall into this grey zone of legality. But we need to know, and it's important for us to know, what are the benefits? Take the politics out of it.
Yep.
What does it help us with? And that's today why we have our guest coming up.
Professor Jennifer Martin is a clinical pharmacologist and physician, and holds an MA in politics and economics from Oxford University, a PhD from Monash University, and a postdoctoral fellowship at the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute. Jennifer's held clinical and research posts in clinical pharmacology since 2000. Professor Martin is the Chair of Clinical Pharmacology at the University of Newcastle, the Director of the Australian Centre for Cannabinoid Clinical and Research Excellence, the Director of Centre for Drug Repurposing and Medical Research. And Professor Martin's at the forefront of research into medical cannabis, and our guest today with us on this Medical Life podcast. Jennifer, thank you for fitting us into what must be a very compact diary.
Oh, good morning. It's really quite a pleasure for me to be here, and I really enjoy the opportunity to chat about this and to get feedback from the community as well.
Right. Well, I'd like to start with the definition of some terms, if you don't mind. Would you mind just clarifying the difference between hemp, hashish, cannabis, and marijuana?
Well, thank you. And that's quite an interesting question for an Australian, really, because I think the way that these terms are used are affected by culture, but also geographic position. And I think in Australia in particular, we have come to use the term marijuana as a term for recreational cannabis. But really, all of these things, such as cannabis, marijuana, hemp, they're all derived from the same plant. But there are different aspects and different ways that the plant's grown to give us different chemicals in the plant. And in terms of hemp is also the cannabis plant, but it doesn't have the psychoactive THC, or it has a very small amount. And the plant's been modified to give us a lot more of a fibrous root, so we can use it for textiles and for lots of other purposes. It also changes the seeds of the plant, so we can actually use the hemp seeds for a lot of other uses and nutritional products. So cannabis is the plant. It comes from Cannabacii. That's the Latin term for it. But marijuana is essentially, particularly in Australia, a term for recreational cannabis. And what was the other one? The hashish.
Yes.
Hashish is really, we don't use it so much here, that term, but it really refers to the trichome or the flowers, and they're crushed to give a very high potency THC product. And we sometimes do see it in some of the illegal products that are sold as resin here. And even though they're illegal, a lot of people actually use them. A lot of patients use the resin, but they're really concentrated in THC.
I really appreciate the fact that you made the reference to the cultural understandings at the beginning of that answer, because if I were to just give you a layperson's reaction to those, I would have dubbed marijuana the stuff that people goof off with in their 18 to 25-year-old age group, cannabis the medical edge, hemp what my hippie brother-in-law wears beautiful clothes made out of, and hashish, I just think Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young.
Well, I think it's a pretty good description, actually, but it's probably not fair and from a scientific perspective that it's grown up because of the prohibition laws and the way we think about illegal drugs. And I think so marijuana itself, that term comes from a Spanish or a Latino part of America. It was grown there for medicinal purposes and called marijuana with an H, not a J. And then people used, and because they used that drug, non-Latino people, I think, referred to it in that sort of negative way as a illicit drug that gives people psychoactive effects.
Yeah.
It is interesting, though.
It is, because I'm sure that impacts trying to navigate this topic through politics and through the media as well, because it's a backdrop that we can't just separate. But
it really is. We didn't want to be caught up in a debate on recreational use or legalization very early on, because I think people felt that this was an opportunity to push another agenda. So we said right from the beginning that we're not getting involved in this recreational debate. We're very interested in the use of this product for medicinal purposes, and we're going to go down the research and scientific pathway. If it has other benefits or contributions to other aspects of the whole debate, then that's an added contribution. But we were really quite clear that we weren't getting into this debate of illegal versus legal, just to try and stick to the actual science. Yeah.
So then just in that question, so from a perspective of talking with doctors, is there then a distinction between medical cannabis and medical marijuana?
I think there's certainly an association, a cognitive association with marijuana being an illicit drug that causes a lot of mental health issues and medical problems. So I think it is important that we realise it's actually the same thing. But certainly, if you think about the teaching, and I teach medical students too, we refer to marijuana as a drug that's not healthy for people's minds and in their, in terms of a developing brain as an adolescent. So I think there's that sort of connotation, whereas I think the medical cannabis, even though it's the same thing, it makes people realize that it's actually a chemical extract that has been scientifically studied for medical use. But it's actually the same thing. So we try and refer to it medical cannabis when we're talking about the medical setting, to try and distinguish ourselves from these assumptions about medical marijuana, but they're actually the same plant. And a lot of patients will come to us and say they want to have medical marijuana, but I think because of the connotations, we're just trying to call it cannabis. Yeah.
So then, looking at it from the medical perspective, what is the current state of medical cannabis at the moment? Depends
on your jurisdiction. So in America, you can just buy it over the counter, and Canada and some of the other countries, like in Israel, not just buy it over the counter. There is a bit of a process to go through, but you don't necessarily need to have a medical grade product that's available for a patient. In Australia, a decision was made not to regulate this as a food product or to legalise it, that actually this was going to be a drug that would go through the Therapeutic Goods Administration process, and we would ensure that we only had quality cannabis products for which we had safety and efficacy data. And we also had dosing data in different diseases, because that would protect the population, knowing that cannabis has got some adverse effects that are really not helpful for a lot of patients. So particularly young people with developing brains, children, elderly patients that don't have much reserve or might have failing brains. And also with this whole issue of driving and safety, it was just felt that was a much safer framework for Australia to introduce this product into practice.
So then what are we actually looking for? What diseases are we using for? What conditions is cannabis either being assessed for or actually being used for?
So the way that people started to look at how we could fill an unmet need was actually to listen to patients who were taking, or people in the community, not even patients, that would take cannabis recreationally, and find out what they were taking it for. And the general symptoms that people would take cannabis for are actually pretty similar to what people take benzodiazepines, things like Valium, or alcohol for. So it was usually for mood regulation, to cope with anxiety, to help with sleep. Some people took it as to help with pain. So there were these symptoms of what some call existential distress. It's usually anxiety-driven symptoms, and that's what people would regularly take, smoke marijuana for. And I think in that setting, it is like alcohol, because it's sort of, it provides that ability for people with some social anxiety to relax in a social group, and it was something that people did together. But in addition to that, and that's a separate group, which actually has been quite difficult from a scientific and a physician perspective to try and design clinical trials around, because it's really a group of, it's a whole lot of symptoms that have anxiety as its root, and yet we know that these therapies, even alcohol and Valium and related drugs, don't actually cure the underlying problem. They make people feel better and it takes away their distress, but doesn't actually treat the underlying problem. Can lead to addiction, though that doesn't seem to be so much of a problem with cannabinoids. But really the existing best practice in medicine at the moment is that rather than just take people's symptoms away, which we often do in the short term so that we can get people into a psychological framework to be able to address the underlying issues. I think we just found that was quite difficult. People were also using it though for epilepsy. And there actually was reasonable animal data that certain parts of the plant in high enough concentrations could actually switch off aberrant electrical cycles in the brain. And I guess we kind of knew that because people that take cannabinoid products often say they feel a bit sleepy or they feel very chilled out, and they can't, cognitively, they're not very sharp. So we're thinking, there seems to be a sort of a human side that would correlate with the animal evidence. And groups in the US and Europe actually have done a lot of work now looking at children with types of epilepsy that is resistant to our current medicines. and actually found with some of those chemical compounds that for some children, not all of them, the actual frequency of seizures reduces. So it does actually work quite significantly for some of the population. But obviously it doesn't work for everyone. And for a lot of kids, they're very sleepy, and trying to get on top of their schoolwork has been a problem. Mm-hmm. Having said that, the carers of the children, so usually the parents, would say that life is a lot better, because even though they're a bit sleepy from the cannabinoid drug that they're taking, having seizures all the time wasn't really helping their ability to learn either. So I think we're sort of getting a bit of understanding from the clinical people that manage children with this as well. So we've got clinical trial evidence, but we also have clinical practice evidence, and the clinicians actually are starting to get a handle on which children benefit, when to increase the dose and when to actually stop it and say this therapy is not working. And actually a group of Australians have just published in the British Journal of Clinical Pharmacology their own clinical experience of using cannabinoids for children with resistant epilepsy. So I think that's a real success story for these products. I think that's amazing. In terms of where the patients, or people that were taking cannabis, wanted us to find a registered use for the TGA which was around all of this anxiety. That just has seemed to be very, very complicated in terms of the clinical trial design, the population, and the fact that it's quite well known that chemicals don't really address the underlying issues. So we're not really fixing a health problem. The jury's still out on all of those symptoms. Yeah.
As a layperson, though, I'd wonder whether buying that time as part of an overall treatment plan would have some efficacy. Even if it's not solving the underlying problem, it buys some pressure relief.
I think that's right. And it's certainly, we don't just have medicine so that we can cure people. You're right. So it's a bridge to therapy. I guess the elephant in the room with the mental health stuff, particularly in Australia, is that we don't have a lot of funding for psychological therapies and all the support networks that we need for mental health. So, we can take away some of the symptoms, but then the next part of what's needed for our population is not actually there. But unfortunately, that's outside my brief. I mean, I do think when I get an opportunity, I should say that, because the number of people with terrible mental health issues who have reached out to us and said, can we please be part of your clinical trials, or how do we get help? It's just an incredible number of people. And similarly, the cannabis clinics that have been set up, that's all done privately. Their data has been reported by the Therapeutic Goods Administration, because they have to apply for permission through the TGA to use these drugs for their patients. And most of the patients using these drugs are actually patients with mental health issues. So, it's a really big unmet need that we've got in Australia.
So can I ask, because I've got this very weird vision in my mind about how we're delivering this cannabis. It's sort of like to children. Is it a tablet? Is it oil? Is it how is the application given?
Yes, so because they have to be TGA registered, there's a careful standard around quality and reproducibility of each product. So, and we're used to that with the pharmaceutical products. We know that every tablet we take is the same, and every batch is the same. It was actually difficult, I think, with a lot of the oils to get that sort of consistency that would make it meet the quality and safety standard. So the companies that have got registered products, and we've got only one actually in Australia for cannabidiol, which is the Epidiolex. So they're actually a mix, but that one is a tablet. And I think it's because it's easier to actually standardize a tablet in that setting. Having said that, there's a product called Sativex, which is registered product used for spasticity and multiple sclerosis to relax the muscles. And that's actually a spray that goes into the mouth and is absorbed across the lining, the buccal mucosa. So they're the two registered products. In our clinical trials, we've used vaporized products, oils. We've used a lot of products, but these are not yet registered by the TGA. And we've certainly had issues with consistency of the batch, particularly when using plant materials. So if we tested at the start of the trial and the end of the trial, they're not the same product. So I think probably tablets and sublingual formulations that can be standardized are probably the way we're going to go in Australia because of this requirement to have a quality and safe, reliable product. So I think that's probably the path that most companies will go down.
Yeah.
So from a therapeutic point of view and from the GP's perspective, what are they likely to be considering in the future that medical cannabis will be a useful therapeutic option?
Well, I think most of our work, I think I said that people overseas doing work in epilepsy and chronic pain and things, but most of our work has been on relieving symptoms at the end of life. So we've got studies in palliative care, advanced cancer, a few others that are sort of relieving symptoms either of the treatment for cancer or the symptoms that you get at the end of life, the distress symptoms. And I think that's a big market. I think it's an area, everyone is fearful of dying. So I think we all have that, but we also have the fear of the symptoms of pain and just distress and the anorexia and the weight loss and all of these symptoms that go at the end of life. And so I think for GPs, that line might be quite helpful for them to have an additional therapy to add on. I don't think that we're going to see blockbusters in terms of cures for conditions. I think some of the community believe that it cures cancer, and we've done actually quite a bit of work with human cancer cell lines, but they actually come from humans with glioblastoma, form of brain cancer, ovarian cancer, and it doesn't look like on their own they're going to be effective, but they certainly seem to potentially have synergistic activities with some therapies, but they're nowhere near the efficacy of the listed therapies that we've got for chemotherapy. So, I think the epilepsy one was great, and I think we had relatively good reason to think that would be effective. But I'm not really sure of any other blockbuster areas that we're going to have great advances in. Having said that, the relief at the end of life is actually an incredibly important area, even if it's not on its own. Just the fact that we've got something else for people to try, I think will be really helpful to our population.
If a GP is considering prescribing this, are they able to at the moment?
Yes, they have to go through, they have to apply to the Therapeutic Goods Administration through the Special Access Scheme because they're not registered products. They can use the two registered products that are there, but they're for specific indications. So the Epidiolex is for children's seizures and the Sativex spray is for people with multiple sclerosis. So if a GP wants to use it for pain, for example, that's off-label. There's no registered listing for that. So they apply to the Special Access Scheme B. And that's paperwork that everybody has because we often have to apply for other indications. Yep. There used to be a very quick turnaround, like within 48 hours. I think sometimes it's blown out to a few days or a week, depending on how many people are applying. But certainly if there's one of the... I think if people, it's pretty straightforward if people fill in all the boxes.
All right. Now, Jennifer, our very last question. For the GPs listening, if you had a chance to leave some closing thoughts with them, what are the most useful things or tips for them to embrace, to understand as we move forward on this topic?
Well, I think it's fair to say that we haven't got good quality evidence that cannabinoids in general should replace any of the other existing therapies that we've got. But if you have patients that have distressing symptoms that the evidence-based practice hasn't been able to find an answer for or to help, then this may be something else for GPs to consider in their practice. We have set up an advisory service for doctors in New South Wales. It's funded by New South Wales government. It's run out of the John Hunter Hospital. It's got it's on the New South Wales Health website. People can ring in and get advice on the literature, and we can give a literature review to the doctor and a summary of products that might be helpful to try and the things to watch out for in terms of the safety. So there is actually that advisory service if people want to know things. But at the moment, there's certainly not evidence to replace anything else that we're doing. but it might just be something for people to consider going forward. And the other thing is just to remind GPs that there are clinical trials going on around Australia, and the more clinical trial data we can get, the more we know about these products, and that helps us know whether that's something that we should apply for TGA registration for. So, please support the research effort too. And even if it's not a clinical trial, just to keep really good records on the patient, because I think that, there may be opportunities for publication of audit of data, in the future. I know that the private clinics have been publishing some of their data. So it's actually really, really helpful to guide the area. So please look out for us, ring our advisory line, we'd be more than happy to chat about that.
I'll make sure Dr. Travis Brown adds that detail to our show notes. Professor Jennifer Martin, thank you for such a grounded and evidence-based update on this topic for us. I think we'll find it's invaluable for all our listeners. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Still can't believe Professor Jennifer made time for us in this, but how interesting. But
yeah, no, it's very interesting. That and the area that this fits into is, well, it's still not legal in some senses of Australia, and so we still do test for it. And it's important to know when you're testing for this, what you're testing for, what's the limitations, and why are we doing it. And yes, the main drug that we're testing for is THC. And so that's the active drug in marijuana. And it's important to note when we're doing what the distinction is between screening for a test and confirmatory testing. And screening for a test means, look, is this class of drug about? And it's just a screening test. It will screen for these drugs in this area. The confirmatory test says, what is the drug?
Right. So if I just had poppy seeds on my roll, would I be positive in the screening?
Now, you have to have the poppy seeds for opioids.
Yep, okay.
So, yes, but you have to have a hell of a lot of them. And this is where people talk about, I was just a passive smoker. I was in the room with my friends. Now, there's no evidence that someone who does passive smoking will ever actually record a THC positive sample. Now, that doesn't mean it can't happen. So what does it mean? It means that if someone says that, you need to test them 48 hours later. And if it's still there, chances are it was, a bit more than just passive smoking. Yes. And so that's the distinction. The distinction between I want a medical or a urine drug screen usually just means I just want to see, is there any classes of drugs here? Right. If you do confirmatory testing, it doesn't just say, are there drugs here? If the drugs are there,
which ones?
Exactly. What is the drug? And the distinction there is when you write medical screen or drug screen, you will get the medical version. You will just get, is there drugs there? If you want to know the drug, you have to state it. Confirmatory testing, please, if appropriate. And so the difference there is sometimes we have legal causes to do the drugs. So this is when it's in the court, and this is when we do the AS 4308. And this is when it's a double urine screen of a supervised urine test. It goes through all the...
Do they take longer? Because I have trouble.
Well, at our age, it might be a bit of a problem. So, supervised, also hesitancy and everything. So it's all a bit of a mix. But the whole field of that is it is a different one, and it's meant to stand up the results in the court of law. Whereas a medical screen won't. It's not, even if you have a positive medical screen, it won't be admissible as court evidence. And so when we're detecting, specifically for THC, when we're looking at it, if someone actually just has experience with it, inhales, has a smoke, if it's a once off, THC stays in your body or is detectable in your urine for 36 hours. So that's how long that episode lasts in the urine that we can test it. But that's not a chronic user. If you are a chronic user, it stays stored in your fat. And the issue with that is even if a chronic user, someone's been using for months to years, it will stay in their fat. If they stop smoking, it's still detectable up to 2 months after they've stopped. So that's the hard thing for someone who's a chronic user. If they need to have a negative drug test, THC included, then they're going to have trouble, and it's going to take them a long time to get them out of the system. So just know that's when you're testing. And as we said, with passive smoking, it's unlikely to make a real dent and be detectable. But if there's, someone must have gone into a room that's,
thick with smoke.
Yeah.
A Cheech and Chong set.
Well, yeah. Right. And the whole point behind that is it's not likely. If you're concerned, retest 48 hours later. If it's there, then they've had a significant event of taking the drug.
All right. Well, thank you. My eyes are much more open now on this topic. In fact, I feel quite mellow. Dr. Travis Brown, thank you again.
This Medical Life is recorded in the Talked About Marketing Studios in Adelaide. For show notes and more information about the podcast, visit thismedicallife.com.au. You can contact the hosts via Twitter. Dr. Travis Brown is at Dr. Travis Brown. That's DR for doctor. And Steve Davis is at Steve Davis. Editing and production is by Tim Whiffen. Design is by Tom Buzenjut. This has been a Pathnotes Proprietary Limited production.
Life is uncertain. It's okay to feel stressed, anxious, worried, or frustrated. CalHope can help. Access CalHope's free and secure mental health resources. Call 833-317-4673 or live chat at calhope.org.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.